Well, hey there, James.
Hey, Mike.
How are you doing today? It's been a while, since we've done one of these.
It has been, yes. Yeah. Couple of
Yeah,
months, and we're not in our usual spot.
we're not. It was just one of those weeks where, because of the way the week went, it made more sense for me to be at home today. And so it's like we're back in the olden days where we do everything on Zoom. Isn't that so exciting and fun?
Yeah, we'll go with that.
Yeah, it's great. Rainy whatevers. Who knows? You're gonna hear cars drive by. If I forgot to like silence my notifications, you're gonna hear like email notifications pop up. It's gonna be like we're right back in 2022. It's gonna be
Let me
great.
get my "You're still on mute" mug.
Yeah, no kidding. I was on a Zoom call yesterday where clearly we've all forgotten how to use it because the guy probably talked for 45 seconds before finally somebody was like, You're muted. And then it's the because they're quiet, but they exclaim, it looks like this. So if you're watching
I
the
start,
video podcast, that made sense. Yeah.
yeah, I started a course yesterday, and same kind of thing. A couple of the students looked like they were a little rusty, but the prof didn't know how to share his screen.
Oh,
Like he shared it, but we were looking at the presenter view the whole time, and it happened 3 times, and we just stopped telling him, like, it's okay.
well, you know
So
what? If the price we pay for being around and seeing each other again is that we're bad at Zoom, I think that's a trade I'm going to take.
yeah, fair. That's fair.
So there you go. Anyways, we're here because we are going to start running the podcast in a little bit more of a season format as opposed to every week. And so we're going to run a podcast through this What to Say series, and then we're going to take a break for Christmas, and then we will probably circle back sometime in January and February for another ride along series podcast.
Mhm.
So looking forward to spending the next 12 weeks with you and to having Brittany back in the fold next week. Hopefully we'll have some other guests as this one goes along as well. So should be a lot of fun. But James, we've started this What to Say series that we've been working on since really February, and then everybody came actually and sat where I'm sitting this spring, right? We all sat in my backyard and sort of talked the series through, and it continued to evolve. What are you most excited about or interested about when it comes to this series? Why are you looking forward to it, and why do you think it could make a difference if we do this thing well and people choose to ride along with us?
Yeah, I think for me, my passion is discipleship. Um, and Paul is probably, you know, in terms of the New Testament, not only is, the great evangelist, um, but he really discipled the early church,
Mhm.
especially from the Gentile perspective. And so many of the letters are, where we draw theological understandings today, even. Um, and so I'm excited for other people to sort of really dig into Paul's who he is as a person, but also his teachings uh, in greater detail, maybe in a way that we don't often take the time to do on our own. So yeah,
Yeah, that should be good. Yeah, I'm excited too. I think it's going to be fun, and I'm excited to see what we're going to come up with, and I think it's a great way to do it. And I'm glad it evolved past, as we were talking about just the introduce series, and it seems like, over the past couple of years, we've been able to just add something different, something new every year, and the ability to try to bring a lot of these pieces together is something I'm excited to see how it goes.
yeah, yeah. And you mentioned the introduce piece. Like we've done the really focused introduce, deepen, serve sequence for I think 2 years now, and so this year not having to have necessarily that sequenced focus, but to say, here's Paul, who is really good at introducing people to Jesus, and so we're going to learn about that.
Hmm.
But he's also really good at deepening faith
Hmm.
and serving in a variety of capacities. And so we're actually really just sort of tying these themes together through our study of Paul. And I think we're going to, grow more as a church because of that in terms of our unity. So
Hmm. It's going to be fun. We're going to spend a lot of this episode actually talking about one of the work along pieces. So we're going to talk about the
Mhm.
workbook that we have. If you don't have a workbook, we have physical copies at the church, or you can go to whattosay.ca at any time and you can download. There's two versions. You can download a PDF version, or you can see an online version that looks a lot more like a flip book. So either of those are available to you. If you are listening to this in a tractor or in the drive, we will try to be as descriptive as possible about what we're looking at, and then you can go back later and have a peek at it. But we didn't want to just throw this resource at people without giving them a little bit of the backstory of how we visioned it out and what we
Mm.
did. So I think how we'll do this, James, is I'm just going to kind of go through the first handful of pages here until we get to that first sermon one from the sermon this past week. And I'll sort of mention a little bit of the inspiration behind this section, and then maybe you can give a couple of suggestions of how people can sort of approach attacking that section. Does that sound okay?
Yeah, and while you're doing that, can I throw one more question at you? Because
Always.
I know somebody who is a has a very structured and ordered mind,
Hmm.
and their immediate response to me when they looked at the book was, "Where do I start? How many
Hmm. Yeah,
pages do I do this week?"
right.
Um, and so, it is in the book. It's not labeled like Sunday one, Sunday two, Sunday three.
That's
So
right.
maybe just touch on a little bit as you're going through the description phase here. Um, how do people use the book?
That's right. Okay, so the first thing then, which might be helpful, is the first handful of pages of the book, from page one to maybe page about 14. They're all like a dark blue color. And those are all intended more as the informational pieces. And then they sort of fade into this lighter blue, which gives a little bit more of the practical. And then the yellow pages are each one of the sermons. So
Mm,
the blue at the beginning of the book, the dark blue and the light blue, they talk more about trying to personalize sort of the backstory of Paul. And that's the section that's an at your own pace section. So some people might want to do it all in one week because they're keeners, and some people might, instead of, doing their devotions one day, they would take their devotional day and they would do one of these books or one of these pages each week for 10 or 12 weeks instead. And that would get you
mm,
through it. Um, I think all of the information is helpful to have early in the series, but at the same time, there's way too much in here to do all at once. And anybody rushing through it is going to miss something. So I would say to that person, where do I start? Start at the beginning, because the beginning is the information pieces. And although there are some reflective parts that I think are important, we'll talk about those. And then the yellow ones, starting with page 20, Paul's journey to Cyprus and Galatia. That is where this past like week's sermon started. And then from then on, we'll move through. So next week, we'll talk about the Jerusalem Council. And then the week after, we'll talk about Philippi. And we will move through the rest of the series through those yellow pages like that. It's a good
right on.
question. So the idea of the workbook was to be less of a theological um, workbook and more of something personal. We know that if we're going to share our faith or know how to talk about it, uh, everybody always hears a story better when it's personal or when you can have your own reflection or your own experience. And so what the purpose of a lot of this book is to sort of maybe pull out some of those experiences that you aren't giving yourself credit for, that you've forgotten about, or
Mm,
maybe things that you didn't even realize you thought, so that when you're thinking about what people ask, you can go, oh, I actually just thought about not maybe that exact question, but how I process something like that very recently. And so that was sort of the first idea. And when you went through the first edit, James, with somebody else as well, you kind of bumped on that right away, that it was sort of a less of a theological workbook and it was a lot more personal. And it was when we talked about the fact that it works in concert with everything else, that was the intention. Having gone
mhm.
through the whole book yourself and read some of those questions just as an overall before we sort of go through the pages here, um, do you think there's enough in here that if people earnestly and intentionally work for it, they're going to learn something? And this is the thing, when you learn about yourself through the context of who God made you, I think you learn about God too. Did you notice any of that in there, and what kinds of things do you think people can look forward to?
Yeah, I mean, having done a lot of small group type of stuff and looked at the way study guides are written and stuff. I mean, the initial reaction to have you ever, you know, talk about a time or think about a time, like these are questions that people sort of, you know, have a negative response to, um,
Mhm.
because it's that self-reflective piece that, you know, it's almost like we feel like we don't have time for it, um, or that it's not going to be beneficial to us because we just assume that, well, we're us and we know all about ourselves. um, but what I have learned in doing those types of exercises is that I don't actually know myself as well as I think.
Mhm.
and and when I actually take the time to do that type of self-reflection, not only do I learn about myself, um, but God meets me in that space and reveals things to me, about what He's been doing in my life. You know, one of the things that I went through you know, in my journey through seminary is I had to write a paper called "Understanding Yourself as a Leader," and sort of, you know, go through the timeline of your life and look at all the significant events that happened and that led up to this moment. And for the first time, doing writing that paper and taking the time to really dig in because somebody said, "Hey, you have to do this for, you know, you want to get a mark." But you know, doing that exercise, and I was finally able to sort of see where God had been working in the circumstances of my life where I just assumed he wasn't he wasn't using it, or it was me, you know, messing up his plan. Um, but in fact, he was, I think I've said this from the stage before too, like he was giving me a lot of leash, but he wasn't wasting any of it. And every
Mm.
experience along the way was training and preparation for what was coming next.
Mhm.
Um, and that discovery, that revelation, I think is of God, but it only came in the space of self reflection. And so these questions that are in the book, I think, are designed to, um, yes, teach us about Paul, teach us about what Paul was doing, but also to put ourselves in Paul's shoes to a certain extent and sort of understand who are we, compared to Paul, and what has God been doing through us? Because I guarantee you, God's been doing something, even if you don't think He
Mhm.
has. Yeah.
And I think that's the type of thing that you've talked about that we're hoping to pull out, right?
Mhm.
What are the things that you're not thinking about or that you don't know as well? I know that I messaged you at 11 o'clock as I was sort of working through one of the pages about an exciting theological uh, uh, avenue that I had sort of wanted to go down, and we were joking and having a little bit of fun, and we'll leave that one as a dangler because I think it doesn't come for another month and a half. But I think that's the page that's going to wreck people in a big way, and so I'm
Mhm.
kind of excited about that one. Like I like not in a sense of like I want everybody to be in a panic, but I think that as we work through this together, and one of the interesting things is that I'm gonna go through it as well, even though, you know, you and I and a couple others were a part of putting it together, because just because we came up with the questions actually doesn't mean that we've answered them yet. Um, so, you know, maybe we'll touch on something each week and try to be a little bit vulnerable for people. But let's do a quick buzz by. I don't want to spend like 10 minutes on each page. This first one that we've got here on pages 6 and 7 shows the characteristics of Paul, his education, citizenship, adaptability, perseverance, and communication, and then challenges us on the other side to think about our experience in those areas. And what we've tried to do is make you think outside the box, right? So many people think they're not smart enough, but education just isn't school. Or adaptability can mean so many things if you've had kids or had to move. Of those five things, education, citizenship, adaptability, perseverance, or communication, in like 90 seconds, which one of those things do you think, you know, either maybe you bumped on or you went, you know, when I saw this, I really feel like everybody could lean into this a little bit more because everybody's got a lot more to offer in this area than they probably think.
Yeah, I think for me, it's education,
Mhm,
but it's not education in the traditional sense or the way that we think about it. Like
mhm,
for as I was just talking about, when I did my own, self reflection and realized the stages and the things that happened in my life and what that taught me and how it trained me for ministry, basically, and how God is still training me and teaching me things. And so I look at education as sort of it's almost like a little bit of a catch-all because when you look at citizenship, Paul's his Roman citizenship, but also his Jewish cultural heritage,
mhm,
they were educational components for him as well, right? And
mhm,
so for me, I think education is the broad category that sort of picks a little bit from everywhere, but has the most impact on who you are and what
mhm,
you bring to the table. And I think that's what these characteristics are really talking about: is what do we bring to the table as God seeks to use us? And Paul had his let's call it a resume, but what's your resume?
mhm,
And the neat thing about this exercise is that you might think that you don't bring anything to the table, but again, if you take the time to really dig into it, meditate on it, ask God to show you, reveal to you, you'll find that He's equipped you in ways that maybe you've never even considered.
mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah. And this never stops. Mine on that, on the education area is so interesting. I grew up in Niagara Falls, so
Mm,
city, tourist town, and then moved to Kitchener and lived in Waterloo for a while. And then, now I live in New Dundee, but it's still like I'm in the city. And every church I've ever worked in has been a city church. And although IPC is a little bit unique in its composition, a lot of farmers. And I got to
mm,
tell you, as a person who's done a ton of Bible studies and a ton of sermon prep and gone through Bible college, so many of those farming analogies have come alive for me in the last 2 years in ways that they never had before because I've talked to people that do the job.
mm,
And that's been so interesting to me. People who you might be riding on a tractor right now going like, I'm not a Bible scholar and I'm not a whatever. But because of, the 35 years of context that I had before I got here that had nothing to do with a tractor or a farm or a plow or an anything. And this week I was getting made fun of by it doesn't matter who, but for not knowing the difference between a straw bale and a hay bale, which is fair. Um, uh, so many of these stories have just come alive for me because I didn't know. So education is wide, and so this section of the book, we'd really like people to do. There are sections of the book where we have lines for notes, but we couldn't fit them in everywhere without probably doubling the size of the book. So we would challenge you, get a Word document, get your journal, whatever it is, and copy these things and actually write them out. Just because there isn't room in this workbook doesn't mean that you shouldn't take the space to write them down. The next three sets of pages are Paul's first, second, and third missionary journeys with some ride-along maps and some information, along with specific questions for people that are maybe going through similar parts of the journey, right? His first journey is that first foray into this. It's going to be a lot of people's first introduction to Jesus. His second journey it takes on a bit of a different characteristic as he goes to new places and talks to different people. Sometimes we notice in Paul's journey the difference between him teaching people who don't know anything about God, and or don't follow Jewish customs, and the difference between trying to teach Christians and how much of a dichotomy between the two things are. And then of course, the third one is his wraparound, and then eventually, he makes his way to Rome after that. Of these three journeys, whether it's the things that were starting, the differences between trying to tell somebody about Jesus who actually has a lot of head knowledge but doesn't understand it, or somebody who's a blank slate. What are you excited about for people to sort of go through? And then the third one, things being disruptive or first theological truths. Some of these questions are fun because they bring people all the way back to the beginning of their faith, right? When did somebody take you on? When did you first hear about Jesus? Name a time that you encountered a Christian that was more difficult than a non-Christian. Name a time that your life got really disruptive. What did you first learn about core theological truths? What do you think people should be excited about in sort of approaching these types of questions when thinking about and talking about maybe their first encounter with Jesus or other people's first encounter, and why they shouldn't just buzz past them because they go, well, I'm 55 and I've been a Christian for 40 years and I know all this stuff. Why should people actually sit down and really spend time to answer these?
Yeah, I think, maybe I'll start at the end of that. Um, like Paul went on 3 missionary journeys,
Mhm.
right? Um, they were distinct. They didn't all happen at the same time. That to me is instructive, right? Like we might think that, oh,
Mm.
I did X, Y, Z, and so that was my contribution, and now maybe I'm done, right? But God might have something else in store for you. He might have um, another act of service, another another mission to send you on for the kingdom that might look similar to something you've done before. It might look completely different, but God's always going to, in my mind, He's always going to keep using you for His glory. And so the question, you know, is what's the next journey? And reflecting on where you've been can inform where you're going next.
Mhm.
Um, and so, like going back and looking at those earlier journeys in detail and saying, well, what are the points on the map, so to speak, of my life where significant things happened? Like when did I develop that core theological belief? And
Mhm.
when was the first time I really had to defend my faith to someone? And go back and reflect on that. Yeah, there's that scripture. Um, remember the idea of remembering your first love, right?
Right.
Um, there's value in going back and understanding those things, because those are the things that formed you. Those are the things that got you to where you are now, the convictions that you have now, and the things that you're doing now. And if you don't understand why you're doing something, or why you think the way you think,
Mm.
or why you believe what you believe, then it's worth taking a look, because you'll never stretch yourself, and you'll never be willing to be stretched if you don't understand where those things are rooted from. I think that's the takeaway for me.
That's really good. The more negative side, which it doesn't usually come from me, which is why this will be interesting, is
Mm,
I wonder if by doing this, people will also discover unhealthy things that they learned about theology growing up and discover some of
mm,
those. So for better or for worse, the evangelical church now has a label, and IPC is in like an evangelical church, but I wouldn't put it under the same bracket as a lot of others, in the same way that not all conservatives are the same level of conservative and not all liberals are the same level of liberal. You can't just paint people with a wide brush. And I was watching this reel of this girl who was saying weird things that I thought were true about the Bible when growing up in the evangelical church. And so two of them, and like she's laughing through them because it's supposed to be a funny post, right? One of them is, I was sure as a child until I was 15 or 16 that at some point I would be martyred for my faith by being thrown into a coliseum. I would ask if I believed in Jesus, and if I said yes, they'd release the lions and they'd chase me and eat me. And like that's an extreme example. But there are people that actually like, right? Or the more, a lot of the stuff that I would hear growing up was like, every time you get on the bus, if you don't share the gospel with every single person that was sitting on that bus ride, it could be your fault they go to hell. Like these are concepts that actually made it through, and I laughed at both of them because maybe the second one more than the first one, but they were both relatable. This
mm,
might be a good time to go through and unlearn some things, or be reflective to try to figure out how those things even entered you in the first place, because there might be
mm,
some things that you're carrying from a a less informed version of your theological understanding that are actually not helping you grow.
Mm. Yeah, yeah, it's a really good point. An example from my own experience, I remember in fourth grade, um, my teacher taught us the JOY acronym. If you're familiar with this,
Yes, I am.
but
I know it all, but tell the people because they might not know.
so the idea of the JOY acronym is that in order to have joy,
Okay.
um, you you would love Jesus first, others second, and yourself last.
Mm.
And it sounds really noble and beautiful. And I don't think
Mhm.
it's necessarily wrong.
Mhm.
But if that is how you live your life,
Yeah, you're
then
gonna
you're not going to be taking care of yourself very often because the needs of others will always overwhelm your own needs.
Mhm.
And so I internalized that teaching as a youngster. And
Mm.
so for, all the way up till actually just as I was entering into ministry, this was how I viewed the world. And I remember doing spiritual direction with someone and unpacking some scriptures, and this is where God led us was to this thinking.
Mm.
Um, and I think where we ended up was I think it's in the Shema. Uh, Love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind, with all your strength. Love your neighbor as yourself,
Mhm.
which is slightly different, right?
Mhm.
It's not love your neighbor before yourself, it's
Mhm.
love your neighbor as yourself,
Mhm.
which supplies this idea that you can't love other people if you don't have something to give in the first place, right? That idea of self-care
Mhm.
allows you to love other people. And I had not been living that way. I'd been giving all of what I had to other people and
Mhm.
not taking care of myself in a lot of areas. And you and I could probably have a conversation about how I'm still not necessarily hitting the mark on that one.
Mhm.
But but I learned something and was forced to confront again something that I had internalized as being a spiritual truth as a young child that had informed me, for the bulk of my adult life,
Mhm.
that wasn't necessarily God's will and intention for me or for anyone. And
Mhm.
so it was only through that self-reflection, spending time with God and looking at the word that I began a corrective. And so I think that's coming all the way back to what this is about. Um, that's what this book is designed to do in a sense is give you the space, give you some guidance to reflect and identify the good, but also where can we correct some thinking too. And instead of just telling you what to think, um, it's directing you where to go so that you can examine the way you think
Mhm.
and also have God inform you through the exercise how he would have you think.
Mhm. So make sure you take some time on that. Again, some of these questions, just because there's 3 questions on a page doesn't mean you do a page in a day, right? I mean,
Mm.
unpacking and unlearning unhealthy theological lessons can take a lifetime to do, even if it only takes you an afternoon to identify. And
Mhm.
so, it's just one of those interesting things about growing up and understanding scripture and God better. So the next couple of pages talk about the themes and topics of Paul's prayers, and on the left side of the book, we've got some of the themes of his prayers and what he prays for and where he can find them. And then on the right side, they're blanks intended for us to fill in on our own. I was thinking this would be cool, in our house, it might be neat to throw this in the middle of the table. And when we say grace with the girls, just choose one thing, to pray
Mm.
for strength and love or spiritual growth and knowledge, just to add in. How do you think people could use prayer prompts like this, not just through this series, but to learn how to, reflect on how to create these prompts for themselves and what to pray for and how to talk to God in a different way?
Yeah, I think oftentimes when we pray, we we have a tendency to pray very broadly or very, and this is going to sound but like a terrible word, but very selfishly.
Hmm. Hmm.
We tend to pray for very broad things, or we pray for things that are, specifically near and dear to concerns. Um, and so, using themes and topics of, you know, what other people have prayed for, in this case, Paul, uh, it sort of encourages us to think outside of um, our own bubble, right? And pray for things that are beyond us, in a very specific way. And I think it gets us closer to praying for what's on God's heart, right?
Hmm.
Like what it is that God would have done in the world. And um, so I think that's one useful application for it.
Yeah, I would agree. I think it's going to be interesting to see how people can use these prompts throughout just things, and I think when you separate things into, unity and encouragement, perseverance and faithfulness, there's so many things we pray for, but if you take it into a specific category, you could actually go deeper on that thing, from that one angle, right? You can pray for the church, you can pray for IPC, but if you pray for the church to have wisdom and revelation, and then you pray for that, and you pray for the church to have spiritual growth and knowledge, and you pray for that, the depth and the thought, goes so much deeper. And so, of course, we would love for you to pray for the church for all of those things, but make sure you're using those as well, and I think they'll be helpful. And now
Yeah,
the
because
next
you may.
page. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
I was just going to say, like, you might be praying for wisdom and revelation, and as you're praying for that for the church, it occurs to you that, who is who is it that needs that the most in our church? And suddenly you're praying for small group leaders, and you're praying for elders, and you're praying very specifically for pastors and leaders of ministries, and then, like you can really drill down into the different aspects of what God's doing. Um, and you might broaden the scope and pray for those things within the broader church community as well. We're not the only church, not the only representation of Christ's body.
It's
And
true.
so we can be praying for other churches to have wisdom and revelation and to be serving God and be doing God's will. Right?
Mhm.
Yeah.
But we want to be the best and the biggest one, don't we, James?
Um,
That was a, you know,
somebody once said, no, I won't go there.
we actually talk about that a lot. We talk about
Yeah.
how the one of the beauty of the church is that there's so many different ones,
Yeah.
and that there's churches that do some things well, and then there's other churches that do other things well, and it's just a beautiful reflection of the body as a whole, right? The body of many parts. And because I don't know how many times you've heard me go on this rant, but it must be a lot, is that I just don't have any time for the comparison of churches from one to another. You want to look into one church and go, is this church following the mission that God has called it to, or the Great Commission, or the greatest commandment? I'm willing to have that conversation. In fact, we, of course, have a small business that helps churches do that. But anytime anybody starts a conversation about, well, the church down the road, I shut it down. Like, I just don't have time for that. If everybody in Innerkip, forget about Woodstock and London and everywhere else, there's 1,200 people that live in Innerkip. If everybody in Innerkip came to IPC on a Sunday morning, we'd have to turn half of them away. We wouldn't have anywhere to put them. There are not enough churches to cover all of the people that we wish were going. So the comparison game is just not something I have any time for.
Yeah. I think something that we've talked about in the past is yeah, we'd love for you to come to our church, but it's more important that you go to a church,
Yeah,
that you're part of
100%.
this, that you're part of a spiritual community. That's what's
Mhm.
important. So
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. Okay, this is one of my favorite sections of the book, and something we're going to touch on every week, pages 16 and 17. The left side is what to say and how to come up with it. And then the right side
Mm,
is a little bit more cheeky and fun. It's what not to say. So we've got this what to say framework that we'll talk about each week and that you've already heard us talk about once. And that's find out the question that somebody's really asking. Express a foundation biblical truth about that topic. That doesn't mean it needs to be exhaustive and you don't need to know everything, but like come up with something that's related. Give a personal experience. And if you're sitting there going, hey, I'm not sure if I have one, then I'm not sure that you've spent time in pages 1 to 15 of this book yet. Because if you do spend time in pages 1 to 15 of this book, you're going to be able to give some kind of personal experience on some level. That's the whole point of the book. And then the fourth one is, actively listen and ask a good question. Of these four things, what do you think people struggle with the most? Or maybe what have
Mm.
you struggled with the most? When somebody asks you a question that you're not sure what to say, is the part that you get most squirrely about the personal experience and the vulnerability, expressing a theological truth, listening to the surface question without taking the half second to ask whether or not that's what they're really asking? Or do you just go into expert mode and you forget to ask a follow-up question because by the end of your lecture, they should know everything there is to know? And I know you're not the fourth one. Um, and some people would look at me and say, I probably am. And there's definitely been moments. Which one of the four do you think you hit on the most? And, how can people work through those things, right? How can they take reps in areas that they need them?
Yeah. Hmm,
I know I didn't prep you on this one. I caught you off the top here.
yeah. Yeah. But the question that you're asking me is not maybe not quite where I would have landed with it. But that's
Well, what's
fine.
the question behind my question? What do you think that is? Yeah.
Well, that's what I'm wondering. Like for me, that's the thing I've been learning.
Right.
Is and so the finding out what question they're really asking, I think, is
Mhm.
the one that I'm learning to do more, um, and that I have struggled with in the past. And I think
Mhm.
that's probably an area where a lot of people struggle, because the question that's being asked out loud is usually charged. You know what
Mhm.
I mean? It's usually loaded. Sometimes it's even a trap. And so if you try to answer that question, yeah, right.
I'm putting that meme in.
It's a
Go ahead.
trap. Um, but yeah, if you try to answer that question, you're not necessarily going to have a positive experience with that person.
Mhm.
But if you can pause and reflect on, what's behind the question,
Mhm.
and then approach that question with sensitivity and humility,
Mhm.
um, it's going to disarm the trap, or whatever the loaded energy is there. Um, but also it's going to set you on a trajectory to having a great conversation,
Mhm.
which is I think where I would land on it. And is that it's not always about answering someone's question, because I think the hesitation for a lot of people is, I don't know if I know the right answer.
Mhm.
I'm not smart enough, or I don't have all the theological concepts to answer the question the way that God would have it answered. Um, I would say to you and to anybody that's thinking that, what I have had to remind myself many times is that what's more important than having the perfect answer is having a really good conversation. And you're going to get a lot further having a good conversation, than trying to say, hey, this is exactly what this means, or this is exactly how to read this, or this is exactly how to understand that. Because a lot of times people aren't ready to just absorb that information. But in the context of a good conversation, they can hear a spiritual truth, they can
Mhm.
hear a theological concept,
Mhm.
and then they can walk away and figure out how to incorporate that into their thinking.
Mhm.
Um, so that's where I would land with it.
And somebody somewhere looks at this and goes, "Yeah, that kind of sounds like a cop out, like you're trying to avoid and whatever." And I hear you.
Mm,
Go through the Gospels, and here's my challenge. How many direct questions that Jesus was asked did he answer?
mm,
It'll floor you how many he didn't.
yeah.
The answer's in there, but he almost never answered a direct question because he understood the heart and the meaning behind the question. And that's right. Every time the Pharisees tried to trap him, or even when the disciples tried to understand something new, he wasn't going to spoon feed them. He was going to teach them how to think about it. But also, he understood that the question they were asking and the thing that was in their heart was different. And we need to do that too. I think maybe we'll take a podcast episode at some point and we'll live just in this space, and maybe we'll give examples of how to do this. I just know that this is one of those things that I had to learn out of necessity as a person who spoke both to youth and to adults. Um, because sometimes you preach and somebody comes up to you and goes, "I really wish I had heard you say this," or "Okay, but you were a little vague, but what did you really think?" And there's nothing wrong with asking me or anybody who teaches what we really think. But you can tell when that question is coming from a place of like there's some heat there. It's like,
Mm,
I didn't hear you say what I wanted and I'm upset about it. And so I'm coming here to make sure you think what I think.
mm,
And if you disagree right away, you got a problem. If you agree right away, you might actually have a problem because that person might be looking to go to somebody else and go, well, but I talked to him after and.
mm,
And every time I have one of those conversations and I try to take this, it's fascinating to see the reactions of people discovering things even about their own question that they've come to me about. It's really hard to do. But it takes a lot of work, especially, even though it's happening. But it almost always leads to a better second, third, and fourth conversation, almost every time.
yeah,
So,
yeah.
yeah. Now on the right side, these were
Mm,
fun. So there's the framework of figuring out what to say. And as we've talked about, it doesn't always mean having all the answers. Sometimes it's about keeping the conversation going. The things on the right here are things that end conversations. Of the four, you should start by reading the New Testament, which is like a deflection, like a, hey, don't think about that. Look over here. Which is in this book because somebody I talked to when I was talking about this told me that story. And I basically just took
mm,
that story and put it in here. Or chastising somebody for clearly not understanding what you're talking about, or you telling somebody what's more important and less important, maybe without realizing that it's framed with your bias, um, or telling people you'll find out and then you just forget about them. Four really bad things to do. Do you have any? I love this question and I will ask it to you because I think it's a fun one. Has anyone ever given you a terrible answer to one of your theological questions? And if they did, do you remember what it was? Because
I
I
got
think for a lot of us, the really bad answers are some of the ones that we remember the most, which is maybe some of that stuff that we need to unlearn in those first few pages of this book for ourselves. So what have you got? What's your worst theological explanation horror story, or at least a good one?
oh, I'm actually going to need time to think about that. I
Okay.
don't know that I'm going to be able to pluck one out of the air for you today.
That's a good
Um,
teaser for later.
yeah, I don't know, but I'll find out.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah.
um,
So
no, I think for me, what I would look at here, something that I think I could touch on is all of these what not to says. They sort of make the assumption that the person you're talking to, what it says to them is that I don't think you've done enough homework, or that you aren't smart enough, or you haven't thought these things through at all. And the reason why these questions are offensive is because that's a really unfair thing to assume about the person who's asking you a question, right? Or um,
or maybe they're
that
doing
they
the
have
homework right now by asking you.
exactly.
Yeah.
But chances are their question is coming from a place of, look, I've learned a bunch of stuff and I've read a bunch of stuff, and I don't know how this fits with that. And so they're not coming to you from a place, very seldom, I would say, if ever, of genuinely, lacking any kind of homework, I guess, that they've done on it. No, most of the time they're in the process, as you've said, of doing the learning, of doing the trying to understand, or they've they've done a ton of that work already and arrived at a conclusion, and now they want to understand how their conclusion fits into what the things that you say and think. And so it's um, these types of responses are just not respecting respecting the work that other people have put in to get to the point where they're ready to ask you the question. And so that's where I would say, like, um, have enough respect for the other to appreciate where they're coming from before you try to drop truth bombs,
Mhm.
right?
Yeah. Yep.
And have enough intellectual humility to say, maybe I can learn something from this conversation too. Maybe their
Mhm.
point of view is going to stretch me in my understanding if I let them, have enough of a foothold to have that conversation with them, right? Does that make
Yeah.
sense?
Yeah. Yeah, it's really sort of like cliche and tropey to say like, well, I learned as much from them as they learned from me. And sometimes people say that, to try to act humble and really they didn't mean it. But in a lot of cases, you can learn a lot about yourself and faith just from other people's questions if you're paying attention.
Hmm.
There's so much that can be learned in every moment. And I think the only thing that I've learned, the deeper I've studied and the more that I've read and the more people that I've talked to, is that there's way more to know than I thought. And every
Yeah.
time I think I go, okay, well, my understanding of a Bible out of a 10 is, if let's say it's a 4. Well, if it was a 4 3 years ago, well, it's a 2.5 today. And I wouldn't be surprised if it's a 1 in 5 years from now. And it's not because I stopped learning, it's because I kept learning. Um, and so, yeah, take that humble approach and make sure you're doing that. Okay, and then the last section here, before we get into the sermon sections, is this section that we just called Understanding Our Environment. And it's a comparison of sort of Paul and his cultural context and his environment in the first century to our context in that today. Talks about pluralism and intellectual skepticism and critique of religion, persecution, which was something that I listened to somebody talk about yesterday, actually, which is really interesting. Somebody who does not have a ton of time for the concept that the North American church is under persecution from others in such a pluralistic society. Um, a lot of what's happening in the church is our fault, and the way that we've treated the gospel or not followed the way that we've done. And nobody's getting no nobody in North America is getting hunted down by religious police and killed and removed from their homes. Like we've just got such a different view of what persecution is. Not to say that there isn't a divide either between Christians and people who believe other things here, in 2024. So dive into those, and then we've got some questions. Here's the one I want to ask you. So there's three here, and we'll just briefly. One is, what do you think Paul's biggest challenge was? What do you think? What is one thing that would make sharing the gospel easier, in your opinion? Those are interesting. What do you think the biggest challenge in sharing the gospel in North America is today? Is of course a really interesting topic all the time. And and like again, I just like if anybody says the stores are open on Sunday and hockey practice, I'm gonna go crazy. Like those are so far down the list of our biggest problems or our biggest challenges. Like it's just it's not even in the neighborhood of some of the biggest stuff that we're dealing with. And you hear, youth leaders and Sunday school leaders complain that, their numbers are down because people went shopping or kids have sports or dance. And I'm sitting there going like, well, if they find that stuff more interesting than what you're talking about, is there a mirror around here? Like what are we what's our responsibility in that as well? I'm wondering
Right.
through some of the theological study that you've done and working at a church and growing up as a PK, as you've evolved, what are one of the things that are one of the biggest challenges you think we face now? And again, if you say hockey practice, this is going to be your last podcast episode for sure. Yeah.
Um,
People
so,
people who don't know us have to know that. Yeah, anyways, it's fine. Yeah.
um, so for me, I think I'll go back to Leslie Newbigin, who was a missionary, I believe, to India and Asia in the 1950s, 60s. Someone's going to fact check me on that, and that's totally fine. Um, but the point that I want to draw from him is that he said the greatest challenge of the church today, in his day, I guess, was how do you communicate the gospel to a culture who has already heard the gospel
Mhm.
and decided that it's actually not good news.
Mhm.
And I think that
Mhm.
speaks to some of the reality what you've been alluding to, that the church in North America has a lot of responsibility to bear in terms of you know egg on our face,
Mhm.
for the lack of a better expression. Um, but I think even in the last 50-ish years or so since Newbigin um, had said that, it's changed a little more yet, because when you look at Paul, bringing the gospel to Rome, he was bringing the gospel to a culture that had never heard it before. This was radical new teaching. Um, Jesus was not someone who anybody had heard about, and I think we're almost back to that in North America, where we're actually a little bit further along than what Leslie Newbigin described, because there is a generation now, I think, that they have knowledge of a guy named Jesus, and something about him, you know, he died and was rose from the dead, and a bunch of people believe him. And that's about the extent, or he was good moral teacher, or whatever. But that's about the extent of their knowledge. Um, and so we're almost in a parallel situation to Paul and the early church in terms of bringing the gospel to people, because while they have our culture has a certain knowledge of the church and that it exists, and like I said, there's this guy named Jesus, but they don't really understand it. And so we've moved past the point of a culture that understands it and has rejected it, to a culture that is mildly aware of it, and actually, um, in a pluralistic society, is probably more willing to listen to it than we give them credit for.
Yep.
The question is, for us, the challenge for us is, how do we bring the gospel to that culture in a way that isn't going to close their ears, but is actually going to open their ears and allow them to hear the truth and see the truth. Um, I don't know if I've said that well or not, but
No, I think
that's
that's
where I would
right.
land.
I think anybody who's ever tried to teach somebody how to do something right after they already learned how to do it wrong would say 10 times out of 10, I'd rather just have a blank slate,
Hmm.
right? I mean, all, whether it's changing the oil in your car or the tires or building a Lego or cooking or whatever. How much of onboarding, if you're in an office job, if you're farming and you are farming a different crop than the person you just hired, how much of your onboarding is unlearning and getting the person to unlearn what they knew coming in. It's half the battle. And I think you're right. I think a generation that rejected the good news is a lot harder to reach than a generation that just hasn't heard it. And oddly, I think you're right. We're moving into a time where there's a lot more people who haven't heard it than have. And the thing about good news when you haven't rejected it yet is it still sounds like good news. Um, and it's a very cool opportunity that the church has, in this next step.
Yeah, and I think the concept of introducing people to a person, and first and foremost,
Mhm.
is instead of introducing them to an organization, a human
Mhm.
institution.
Mhm.
Um, that's a big part of how we do that.
Mhm.
Um, the church it's God's idea. It's the work of the Holy Spirit, but it's this liminal space, right? It's a human organization, but it's also a spiritual community. And I think you don't get to the point of understanding that and learn and being able to sort of navigate that the way that
Mhm.
people who've been in it for a while sort of expect. You don't get there unless first you meet the person of Jesus, and first you get to know him and the way that he would have um, you interacting with the world, and the things that
Mhm.
he would have you value, and the things that he would have you um, think and do and believe. um, and once you understand the person of Jesus,
Mhm.
then you can approach the concept of the church, I think, with a different viewpoint. And I think where we've gone wrong in the past is we've said, hey, here's the church,
Mhm.
and by the way, there's this guy named Jesus. um, so we have to, yeah, that's the hard part for us today is, yeah, that guy that sort of exists in your frame of reference. Would you
Mhm.
like to know more about him? Because I could share some things. You know.
And that's why, leaning on and following our mission statement at the church is so important. We are creating opportunities like the Fall Carnival or Santa Claus Parade or summer events for people to come and to get to know us. But the mission statement isn't introduce IPC, grow deeper, you know,
Hmm.
serve others. It's introduce Jesus. And so
Yeah.
when we're more worried about introducing people to our church and our programs and our culture and our people than we are to God, we're going to run into a problem, and we should. And I think, most churches that you're seeing that have run into problems are churches that were a lot more interested in introducing them to them than to
Mm.
Jesus. And not all the time. And that's a broad brush statement that I just want to make sure I go like most church plants don't start like that. And the inherent risk, and we're talking about this on a leadership level all the time, right? The inherent risk of a church that grows is that you start talking about different things sometimes by accident, and you start to veer by accident, and that it's it's not mission sprint, it's mission drift,
Mm.
right? You're listing lazily to the left. You're
Yep.
like it's and you don't, it's if you've ever been in a lake in a kayak and you just stopped paddling for 10 minutes and then you looked up and went, like, I'm 500 meters over here and I didn't do anything wrong. I just stopped doing what I was doing for a minute.
Yep.
And as IPC, even to make this super personal for us, has grown in the last year and a half from, an average attendance of 120 or 130 to an average attendance of 250, which is about what we're at. It's great to look at that and say, hey, things are happening, whatever. But it's pretty easy to start making decisions with that stuff in mind first. And
Mm.
we've caught ourselves, like, not overtly, but like, because we are intentional about talking about it as often as we can. We catch ourselves every once in a while, but we're at risk of that too, right?
Yep.
Of all of a sudden accidentally making it about ourselves. And oh boy, then we've got a problem.
Yep.
And that's just, that's why one of the biggest challenges is always going to be us. It's always going to be the church.
Yep.
Because you start doing something interesting and people want to come watch. And then you go,
Yep.
oh, hey, did you see how many people came and watched? And then you're in trouble.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep.
It's this weird, like, just the two of us talking, nobody's listening. Like, it's weird. Like, it's really oddly hard to be in a church leadership position and have to manage the dueling expectations of that, right? Growth shows that you're maybe spreading the gospel and you're doing something that's worth seeing. But you don't want to grow for growth's sake. But if you were a certain size and then you shrink, that causes a whole bunch of problems that you think the solution is growth. And it's like this weird, I don't think I'll ever figure it out. I think the trick is to just make sure we know who we're introducing each other to. But I don't know if you
Yep.
find that. And now we're just sort of off on a tangent, but
Tangents are
but
fun.
it's tough, man. It's just one of those weird leadership pockets that exist when you work in a church. It's so strange.
Yeah. Yeah. I think it's why um, we do spend so much time talking about mission,
Mhm,
um, because we have to keep Jesus at the center.
mhm,
And um, everything, like when we started talking about it, um, a month or two after you came and you sort of said, hey, we need to be talking about mission, vision, and method. And they moved from being buzzwords to being concepts that we
mm.
needed to actually wrestle with. Um, no, I lost my, there goes my train of thought.
Can I tell you the risk in that? This is interesting,
Yeah.
and this is something that I'm learning too,
Mm,
is that, you can talk to anybody. I'm a mission guy, right? Um, but the mission can become the mission.
yes. Yeah.
And that's one of those bumpers. Everybody's got a different bumper that they bump up against. And that's one of the ones that I'm bumping up against. Not because like we shouldn't do it, we shouldn't talk about it. But if the mission becomes to make sure you're fulfilling the mission, which sounds
Mhm.
weird, right? Then that can also become a problem.
Yeah.
It just
Yeah.
happens. It's so small. It happens so fast.
Yeah.
Uh, personally too, right? Personal life, church life, work life. It's incredible. So, yeah, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah.
What else you got there?
No, it's okay. But the idea that the mission is a tool.
Mhm,
Um, and so we talk about it a lot so that we don't forget it, but also that we press everything that we do through that tool,
mhm,
um, as a church. And so that's been really helpful, I think, to me in terms of framing. Um, what am I thinking about in ministry? What are the things that we're doing in the various small groups, for instance? If what we're doing is not in pursuit of our mission,
mhm,
then that's where we could get off track. But pursuing the mission is, if we're doing it right, is kingdom focused.
mhm.
And so then I think that's the grounding point. If we're doing it for the mission's sake, like you say, then we've lost the plot again in a different way. Um, but if the plot is kingdom building, which is, I think, we talked about Great Commission and Greatest Commandment, um, if that's the focus and the purpose behind the mission, and we're
Mhm.
pressing everything that we do through that to make sure that we're staying on task, that's that healthy balance point that we have to walk.
Yeah.
Yeah,
This is on page 5 of things that keep me up at night. So let's move on before I get too many more nightmares. But good to talk
there you
about.
go.
We've been going for a little while, so let's hit this last page, and then we've got a question I think that came through. So we'll make sure we hit that, and maybe we'll circle back and make sure if people didn't hang on this long, that we get it back there. This past week, we just talked very briefly about Paul's journey to Cyprus and Galatia, and that first leg of the journey. And this week, coming up next, is the Jerusalem Council. Again, some of the things that we tried to do here, and we're going to talk about this week to week, is we tried to personify the places. So in this book, you're going to see a small profile of each city or place that he went, and then it says if Cyprus were a person, or if Galatia were a person. And of course, you can't describe an entire person by one or two sentences. That's not the point. The point is to sit here and go, what part of this city can we make actually personally relatable? And what can you learn about other people's experiences from the entire city of Galatia? So if Galatia is a resilient community organizer or a social justice warrior, one of the things that area could have been known for, and Cyprus was very entrepreneurial. What we look at on the other side is that entrepreneurs and activists have things in common, and those things are they don't wait, they move. Action,
Mm,
let's go, right? They're innovative, they're resourceful, they're persistent, and they just move. And not everybody holds all 8 of the characteristics that we've put here, but most people are going to have at least one of them or two of them. And looking at, which ones you are leaning into and which ones you struggle with will actually help you understand other people's spiritual journey and will help you grow in your own, right?
Hmm. Yeah. Yeah. And the value in this is not just understanding who you are and how you're wired, um, but and other other cities as we go along, and different personality types. It helps you to understand the other people in our community
Mhm,
in a different light. Because if I'm a and I'm not, but if I was an entrepreneur and I just viewed the people around me as if they were all entrepreneurs, I
mhm,
would become disillusioned, dissatisfied with my community pretty quickly. But if I learn to recognize that, you know, there are members of the community around me who different cities than me, uh, to borrow the analogy, um, that helps me in terms of how I frame my role, their role, and how we interact as
mhm,
part of a community. Because I think that's the reality for the church today is that the churches today are not like this, these personifications of cities. They're made up of all different types of people.
mhm,
Um, and so gaining that perspective of, we're not all the same, but we all bring something unique and special to the table. We work together. I think that's really valuable.
mhm. That's good. Cool. And then, each week after that, we go through the series. At the end, there's a spot where you can write down people that you wanna pray for. There's the resources there in the back of the book, and then some area to take some notes. Of course, all of this stuff and, even updated resources. Somebody sent me a resource this week that I thought was a cool
Mhm.
resource, and so we, checked it out, and then we immediately put it on the website, the What to Say website. So, as other resources that other people in our congregation have found helpful, we will just continue to populate, this resource hub so that by the end of it, our hope, one of the things that we talked about in this series is our hope that this workbook isn't something that you just have for the next 12 weeks. It's something that helps shape the way you can think and share the gospel for months and years to go. If you write in it or write notes or stick notes in it, hopefully it's something you can go back to. And the idea of having all of this stuff centralized is that if, in a couple of years you want to go back or you think that somebody could really use it, it's in an easy to find place. And so we really hope that this series is evergreen, past the next 12 weeks. But we're really trying to put something together that helps people grow in their faith and be introduced to Jesus long after this series is over. So I've got an idea here, James. I think that, this podcast has been about an hour, and the question that you got deserves some time. So let's end this podcast episode now. We'll stop recording, but then you and I'll stick around and we'll answer the question and we'll put that on social. Maybe we'll do the answer as a quick video on social, and then we can attach it to an email and a couple other things, and we'll use it as a piece of content somewhere outside of there. And then in future podcast episodes, if we stack 2 or 3 questions, maybe we'll just do that. Or week to week, we're going to figure out sort of what these look like. Any
Yeah.
final thoughts before we end this episode? Is there any specific part of the series that you're, excited or interested about? What have your initial reactions been for the first couple of weeks? And what do you hope and praying for as we move through it?
Yeah. I think for me, the thought comes to mind, some people wonder, do we put too much emphasis on someone like Paul?
Mm,
Um, and, shouldn't the emphasis be on Christ? Um, I don't know if I have a good answer to that, but there's a lot of theology, a lot of good theology that Paul brings to the table that's relevant to our lived experience in North America today. I think we have a lot to learn from Paul. And I think the other thing that I would sort of draw on for that is if if you're concerned about do we focus too much on Paul, then do a comparison for yourself between what Paul writes and what Christ said. And if you're worried or you're concerned about that type of idea, just compare Paul to Jesus because that's what we do, for ourselves. We compare ourselves to Jesus, right? And how are we doing? Jesus is the litmus test. Uh, so I think for me, that's the thing that comes to mind, and the encouragement is if you're struggling with, the amount of emphasis on one person. Um, in one respect, it's easy to say, well, he wrote like half the New Testament, so he must be important, but that's not necessarily satisfying to the question. And so I think it's better to say, like, if you're genuinely concerned about it, check him out, check him out against Jesus, and yeah,
Mhm.
for what
If
that's
you
worth.
want to see how IPC takes this concept and focuses on Jesus, go back literally 1 year in our YouTube videos, in our sermon series, because last year's this whole concept was we used Jesus and how he introduced himself as opposed to using Paul. So if you weren't here a year ago, or like a reminder, you can always go back and watch those too. Yeah, I'm just looking forward to seeing how it unfolds, seeing what people take out of it. Um,
Mm,
I know that as we designed it, I've got some things that I hope people take out of it, but I'm always curious to see whether those are the things that actually happen, or um, if something different happens or comes about. Like, I really think that there's a lot here that we've put together, and I'm looking forward to see how some of it that we did never intended it as anything, maybe as other than a throwaway or like an obligatory, turns into the thing that somebody is impacted by. And I think for me, one of the most fun parts of my job so often is how I work really, really hard to try to do something, and that
mm,
thing doesn't do anything. And the three things that I didn't think of, didn't try hard, and didn't have anything to do with me at all, are actually the things that made the difference. And so I'm looking forward to those moments too, because they're usually better. So
mm.
it should be fun. Yeah.
Good
Uh,
stuff.
what are you up to this weekend, James? Anything exciting happening?
I think there's a carnival happening.
Yeah, that's right. Giving away that we're actually recording this before the next sermon, but yeah, the carnival's in like 36 hours, right?
Maybe
So
you'll edit that part out.
yeah, 2 days away from that. So an email's going out today to see if somebody has a truck to drive a popcorn machine over. So I guess we're going to find out by the time this podcast comes out whether or not we have popcorn for the carnival.
Nice.
We can always revisit that, but yeah.
Yep.
And then you're taking a couple days off next week, which will be exciting.
Yeah, shortly after this airs, I'll be taking a couple of days just to rest, and I'll be unavailable, I guess.
Which is good.
But yeah,
We'll enjoy that. And thanks for hanging in and coming for another season of the podcast. And I'm looking forward to spending a few weeks here talking to you and Brittany and whoever else we can drag in about what to say and how to talk to people about Jesus. So
sounds good.
have a good day. We'll talk to you soon.
Awesome. Thanks.